Hey guys, Coach JP from BTG Fitness. Over the last few years, while I've been going down my own journey with making my own sourdough bread, I've had a number of people ask me for instructions or videos on all the different stages, feeding the starter, mixing the dough, all that kind of thing. So I've put together this compilation of clips to show you how to do all the little bits and pieces. I'm not a professional baker, even though I do have some professional culinary training. This is just a really simple, straightforward way to make some good sourdough bread at home, which is much better bread for you than most commercially bought bread. Only has three ingredients, water, flour, and salt, and the naturally occurring bacterial yeasts in the sourdough itself. And then, of course, one of the big ingredients that sourdough people will tell you need is time. It does definitely take longer to create a loaf of bread using the sourdough process, especially the long fermentation process like what I use, versus a yeast bread, which you can go from start to finish in a matter of a few hours. Sourdough generally takes about 24 hours from start to finish, from mixing the starter through till actually getting a loaf of bread out of the oven. Anyway, here are the clips, and hopefully you find it helpful. All right, thanks. Hey guys, so the first step in the sourdough bread making process, presuming you have a viable starter already, is feeding your starter before you mix the dough. So to do that, you need your stored starter, which I got came out of the fridge. I'll just show you here. You can see there's a little layer of liquid on top. They call that hooch. It's literally some alcohol that has been created from the yeast. You can pour that off if you want, or just leave it in with the mixture. Then I always use a 1 liter Pyrex glass measuring cup for mixing my starter in, because the way that you know that the starter has been revived enough to make bread with is that it will approximately double in volume. So first step is we take a little spatula, put all of our starter in here. Oh, sorry, and I'm doing this on a digital scale as well. With everything to do with the sourdough process, for me, I do it by weight because it's the more accurate way to measure, especially with the flour. The weight of a certain volume of flour can vary depending on the ambient humidity, all that kind of stuff too. So and how densely it's sitting packed in the container. So going by weight is always more reliable. So in my storage starter, I've got 100 grams that I keep in the fridge. I usually bake bread maybe once every couple weeks right now. I've had the starter sit in the fridge for up to a month in between feedings and still successfully made bread with it. So up to you how you want to do that. In fact, I can see it kind of lost a little bit of moisture, so it's actually at 95 grams right now instead of 100 grams. That's okay. I'll account for that with the mixture. So when you feed the starter, what you need is whatever amount of starter you want to have for your recipe. You start with a quarter of that amount of starter. So if I need 400 grams for my recipe, I start with 100 grams of starter, and then I'm going to add 200 grams of water and 200 grams of flour. So again, going by weight, I'm going to zero my scale out. And the water should be lukewarm. You don't want it too hot, because that will end up killing the bacteria in your starter. If it's too cold, it'll just take a bit longer for it to get active and double in volume. So I've added my water. I'm going to mix that and the starter. The starter won't completely dissolve in the water, and that's okay. You just want it fairly well mixed. And then I'm going to zero my scale again. And I'm mixing this with a plastic chopstick. It's actually the best way to mix because stuff isn't going to stick to it. It's better than using your finger or a spoon that's got like little crevices that stuff is going to sit in. It'll be hard to clean up. So now I'm going to add 200 grams of flour. I use 65 grams of wheat flour, like whole wheat, and 135 grams of unbleached white flour. The whole wheat, just in theory, will potentially have some more bacteria in it than the white flour, so it'll just make the starter a little more active. Okay, so now that it's all mixed together, or it's all in the measuring cup, now I'm just mixing it. Okay, and you'll see that now it's getting kind of thick. I'll mix up like that. The other tool that I use, and you want to mix this really well, get a lot of air mixed into it. Okay, and the other tool that I use is this silicone spatula. So just clean down the chopstick, clean down the sides of your measuring cup. You don't want that kind of little film of flour and water to dry and turn into concrete on the side of your measuring cup while this is all rising. You can also give that a little bit more of a mix with the spatula, and then I just kind of use the chopstick and the spatula back and forth to clean each other off until it's all in the measuring cup. Okay, and then take 2 tea towels. Like these are just nice thin cotton tea towel. They're terrible for drying dishes, but they're actually perfect for this. Dampen them with lukewarm water and then cover the measuring cup with them. I'll spare you the video of me going back to the sink and dampening these and then covering them. So once it's covered, let it sit at room temperature for between 7 and 10 hours usually. That'll get it to where it has doubled in volume. Again, that's why it's crucial to use something like a measuring cup where you can see the volume. And one other tip that I always forget to tell people, if you have stone or any kind of granite countertop, don't leave it on the countertop, especially in cooler weather, because the stone kind of acts as a heat sink and it stays really cold and it'll actually slow down the fermentation process. So if you have stone countertops, put the measuring cup on a cork mat or something to insulate it from the stone, or better yet, put it on a wood dining table or wood surface for the rise. Hey guys, so it's about 9 hours later. You see that the starter has more than doubled in size. It's actually pretty close to 900 milliliters in volume. So the first thing that we need to do in order to keep our sourdough journey going is to reserve the 100 grams of starter from this mix so that we've got starter left for the next time we want to make bread. So first I'll just scoop some of that out back into the container that I store mine in the fridge. And again, I'm using the scale because we want to go by weight. You'll see it's got quite a thick texture and a kind of puffy consistency to it now. Okay, we're almost there. Oops. Okay, so there's my 100 grams of starter that's going to go back into storage. So that I just throw my lid back on, throw it in the fridge, and then it's good to go. So now with the rest of it, I'm going to mix the dough. So I've got the biggest mixing bowl that I have in my kitchen. Zero out my scale again. Just because I want to know exactly how much starter I've got before I start adding the water and everything, I'm going to put all the rest of this into my bowl. So it took about 9 hours for this to double, actually about 8.5, which is kind of halfway time-wise with what I've seen with my starter in the past. It was a little bit cooler today, so it did take a little bit longer. So I've got 395 grams of starter, which is basically what I was expecting, probably an extra gram or so in there. Now I'm going to mix the water in. So I'm going with a 63% hydration ratio for my dough, which is what I normally do. So what that means is with your total weight of flour that you have in the recipe, you want 63% of that weight in water. So I'm aiming for a total of 1 kilogram of flour. So I need a total of 630 mils of water. 1 milliliter is 1 gram. There's roughly 200 milliliters in the starter, because remember the starter is half water, half flour. So I need to add 430 mils or 430 grams of water. Okay, so now I'm going to give that a good mix. Especially now that the starter has been refreshed and it's got that kind of foamy, thick consistency to it, it for sure is not going to actually dissolve completely in the water. And again, that's totally okay. We're going to take care of that when we knead the dough. In fact, this has dissolved not too badly for today. The next thing that I need is to put my salt in the mixture. For this recipe of dough, I go with 24 grams of salt. Again, it's by weight. It's roughly a tablespoon and a little bit. So I've zeroed out my scale again. I'm going to mix in. So a tablespoon is 21 grams. Okay, that's my 24 grams of sea salt. Give that another mix. You can also mix or put the water in first, dissolve the salt, and then add the starter. That also works. That's how a couple of recipes that I've seen call for it. So I'm going to zero out my scale again. I did pre-weigh out all this flour. It's another 800 grams of flour, because remember I've got about 200 grams in my starter. So I'm going to add this all in. Okay, I almost forgot that I had the spatula in there when I zeroed out the scale, which made me think I didn't have enough flour, but once I put that back in, it came out to the 800 grams that I was expecting. So now I just mix with the spatula. Again, this can be done with the plastic chopstick. It's a really handy tool for mixing the dough. I can actually take this off my scale now, because I know I've got what I need in there. So you'll see it's a very floury mixture right now. The thing with the sourdough doughs, a 63% hydration is actually pretty dry. I've seen lots of recipes that call for upwards of 70-75% hydration. For me, I just found that way too messy to work with. So I settled on eventually this 63% hydration mix. You'll see I'm just kind of trying to incorporate all the dry flour into the dough as much as I can. And back when I first started making my sourdough bread, when I was making pretty much exclusively the big Dutch oven boules, this is all I actually did. I didn't knead the dough at all. I just basically took the spatula and kind of chopped in all of the dry flour until it seemed like it was pretty well mixed. The last year or so, I've started doing proper kneading on it just to get it that little bit more consistent. Plus, it gives a little bit tighter grain or tighter crumb, but still a lot of lift to it. if you let it rise properly. Okay, so now I'm just going to clean that off. I won't actually video the whole kneading process because that takes about 5 to 10 minutes. But basically at this point you could let the dough sit for 20 minutes to do kind of an autolyse is what they call it, where the flour and the bacteria in the flour and all that activates with the contact with the water. I haven't found that it made a huge difference to the quality of the dough when I've done that versus when I haven't, so I'm not going to do that today. So I'm just going to turn it out. I have a small bowl of bench flour, I call it, so I usually when I'm going to be dusting the countertop with some flour, I just scoop it into a bowl, and then whatever I have left I just throw a bit of saran wrap on it to save it for next time. So now I'll just flour my counter and turn out my dough. Okay, and then I'm going to go through and knead it for anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes until it forms a pretty smooth dough. You can either oil your hands for the kneading process or continually keep flouring your hands so that the dough doesn't stick. Even at the 63% hydration, it's going to stick quite a bit. So you want to do something to keep the dough from getting on your hands. Oh, you also want one of these, a bench scraper. Really helps in this process. You just keep scraping it off, or scraping the dough off the counter and going through your kneading process. So I kind of use this in one hand and then use a hand to actually do the kneading. All right, after this, the dough is going to sit for about 10 hours before I take it out, shape it, punch it down and degas it, get rid of a lot of the built up air, and then shape it for it to do its final proofing before I bake. So that'll be tomorrow morning. Okay, so this is after the bulk fermentation or first proofing of the dough. I did take a picture of it, I'll tilt it up there so you can see it. Normally I go about 10 hours with this, but again, because it's been a bit cooler weather the last couple days, it needed a little more time. So it's been about 12 hours since I started that. So the next stage is dividing up the dough if you need to. This recipe of dough, which I'll post or link somewhere below this, is enough to make one of the Dutch oven boules that I started with, but with my Emile Henry bread cloche and the mini baguette baker, this recipe can actually be divided into two. So today I'm making a boule and 3 mini baguettes. So I'm gonna basically turn the dough out onto the counter and cut it in half. So just flour the counter, and actually I'm gonna grab one of my spatula. So again, same silicone spatula. I'm just trying to make sure that the dough doesn't tear as it comes out. So I just work my way across as it's coming out onto the counter. Okay, so for the baguettes, to get the right size on those, I know that I need a dough weight of roughly 825 grams, because you lose about 1/10 of the weight of the dough as it bakes, and each of the mini baguettes should be somewhere around 250 grams when they're finished. So that should be about half of this dough. So I'm just gonna, again, using my digital scale, weigh that in. That's 821. That's 825. So that's my dough for the baguettes. So then the remainder of this is going to be for my boule. So you can see it is quite soft and pliable, the dough right now. So the first thing when any shaping, if you're doing the sandwich loaf or a boule, you actually make it into a ball to begin with, just to create tension in the dough. So I do that, let me just pull this back so that you can see. I fold in all the edges to the middle and then kind of press them in. Okay, as you do that, you'll get little air bubbles coming up in the dough. That's fine, they'll kind of squish out as we continue the process. So now that I've folded those all in, I flip the dough over so that that crease is on the bottom, and now you just do what they call the finger drag. So just having your hands open like that on the counter, just pull the mass of dough towards you and keep turning it about a quarter turn with a little bit of pressure down on the dough. So then you'll see it makes quite a pronounced ball as you do this, because it's creating surface tension in the dough. Okay, and then you can kind of just turn it and tuck under the bottom, and you'll see the bottom's got like a little bit of a crease to it. You can go through and pinch that closed. That way it won't open up, or at least hopefully won't open up in the process of rising in the bowl. So now for the boule, I take my little glass bowl. The reason I'm using this one is because it fits exactly inside my bread cloche. And then line the bowl with the tea towel. So same tea towel that I've been using this whole process, still slightly damp, which is fine. And then you're going to take some of your bench flour in a little mesh strainer, like a tea strainer, and you want to flour the whole inside of this bowl of the tea towel so that the dough won't stick. You also want to try and make sure that there's as few creases to the towel as possible in there. Then you also flour the dough ball. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that this all sticks when you try and release it to put it into the bread cloche. If that happens, then the bread's going to tear just before you're wanting to bake it, which is going to be terrible for the results. So now I've got that in there. I'm going to flour the top of it as well so that it doesn't stick. That also makes sure that a little bit of flour gets down the edges. Okay, and then this one's ready to go. So I just lightly fold over the edges of the tea towel. I want to leave as much room as I can. You don't want it tight because we want this dough to rise. So I'm going to set that aside. I'll just throw the lid on top of it. It's not tightly closed, it's just resting on top. Okay, so that one's good to go. So next I need to divide the other half of the dough for the baguettes into three. So 825 divided by 3 is roughly, would that be 270, 275, I think it is, yeah, 275, 810, 825, yeah, so 275. So I need 3 275 gram pieces, so that's 291, so that's a little too big. I'm using the bench scraper cutter to trim the dough as I go. So that's 271, so I took off a little too much. That's 276, which is close enough. And then next one is 285, 270, 277, which is pretty close. 271, yeah. So we'll take a little bit from each of these just to bring that up a bit. There, okay. So now I've got 3 roughly equal sized pieces. Same process as with the boule. First you want to just tuck in all the edges towards the center and make a ball. Okay. So then again, the finger drag technique. Okay. I'm going to pinch this seam closed. And you can get pretty aggressive with the pinching. If you don't, it's still going to open back up on you. And then to stretch it out for the baguette shape, because I want to keep that seam on the bottom, I don't necessarily want to roll it too much. So I'm actually going to just roll it back and forth very short, okay, and drag my hands outwards as I roll to stretch it. With this, if there are little air bubbles at the end, I do try and pinch them out because you will get like a big bubble in the baguette, which is not good. Okay, so it's making a long cylinder kind of shape like this. Let's just get these out of the way. So this is the baguette baker. So the baguettes will do their final proofing straight in this. I don't wash this in between baking. You actually just kind of dust it off because every time you use it, it's going to get more seasoned and then won't stick. Before the baguettes go in there, just like with the tea towel, we want to pretty generously flour it. With this, actually, if you flour the baguette dough sufficiently before it goes in, I haven't really had it stick too much. The worst sticking that I get with the baguettes is actually when they rise up over the edges of their little slot, that they stick to each other. But that is a nice problem to have because that means that your baguettes have actually risen quite well. So now I just lay that in, and it's not quite the full length of this. It will, as it rises, start to fill that out a little more. And again, I'm just going to flour over the top of it. And really important that you get down the sides with this one, again, so they don't stick to each other. So that's basically it for the shaping stage. I'm going to do the other two baguettes and pop them in, and then we're going to let the dough proof for another 4 to 6 hours for it to get the last rise, and then we're going to go into baking the bread. Hey guys, so the dough has been doing its second proofing for about 6 hours now, and it's basically ready to start baking. If you look at the baguettes, you'll see that they've actually risen a fair bit. I had one that just kind of spilled over the edge there, so they've risen a fair bit. They will rise a little more as they bake. They'll get what they call the oven spring once they get that exposure to the heat. So the next thing that we need to do is actually to score the loaves so that you get that nice kind of split with them. Now, to do that, you'll want the sharpest knife that you have available. One of the mistakes that I used to make with the baguettes in particular is not scoring deeply enough. Getting the scoring deep is how you get that really good opening up. Otherwise, it just looks like a weird scratch on your loaf. You also want to score at an angle, slightly along the length of the bread, and don't score straight down. Score at a little bit of an angle to the side. So I'm going to go quite deep. Okay, and do the same on each one of these. And what the scoring does, aside from making a nice pattern to the bread, is it helps the oven spring and the lift that the bread gets as it bakes go in the direction that you want, rather than just like bulging right in the middle. So the baguettes are ready to go. I'm just going to throw the lid back on here. And then the boule. So again, it was rising in my mixing bowl with the floured tea towel. Ideally, I'd like to see a little more rise before I bake it, but it's pretty good, just based on how much the baguettes have risen, I'm going to go with it because I want to bake them at the same time. So the way to get this out into the bread cloche is you basically just invert the base of the bread cloche onto the bowl, and then I'm going to quickly flip it over. And then I want to lift the bowl off and very gently remove the tea towel. And hopefully it's not going to stick much. It's sticking a little bit here, so I'm just trying to fix that before I pull. You want to be really careful with this because if you tear it, again, you're going to release all the air that has built up in it. So probably needed a little more flour to not stick here. I'm actually just going to use the back of the knife to help with releasing this rather than my fingers. Okay, you got to be really, really patient with this and careful, because if you tear it, you're going to definitely get worse results. Now, why tearing it would be worse than scoring, because when scoring it, we actually want to break the surface of the dough, is because then you've got kind of uncontrolled pattern to it when it tears. Plus, with the tear, it's going to take a big chunk out of it rather than having just a neat slice to it. So I've almost got it off. This is where it's going to get tricky because I'm going to be going down kind of the down slope. So I'm just using the back of the knife. I can't remember if I said that I was using the back or not. Almost there. So sometimes things don't go perfect, and that's okay. Bread, thankfully, is pretty forgiving. It's not like pastry or cake making where it's going to really, really punish any kind of deviation from the norm. I've also got this not quite centered, so I'm just going to carefully turn it. Okay. Now, I want to actually flour this a little bit more before I score it. That can help the scoring be nice and smooth. Unfortunately, my tea strainer is not handy. It's in the dishwasher, so I'm just going to sprinkle the flour by hand from high up to get as even a pattern as possible. Okay, and now I'm going to score it. With the boule, lately I've liked scoring it in a square, so I'm going to score it all 4 directions. Okay, so you can see right there. And then the lid goes on it. And you'll see it deflated quite a bit as soon as I scored that. That's okay, we're going to get that lift from the oven. So now I'm going to convection bake them at 460 degrees. Put it in right at the beginning. I don't actually preheat, so it gets a little bit of a gradual heat up and then should get a nice spring to it. So 460 takes about 45 minutes. About 25 minutes in, I take the lids off of these so that we get more color on the top of the loaf. And we'll see how it looks in about 45 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 45 minutes since the bread went in, maybe a tiny bit longer. The bread's finished baking, so this is a baguette. I've got 3 little mini baguettes and the boule, which is right here. So you'll see this one didn't get a huge amount of rise, but it's got good volume, so I think it's still going to be, it's really hot, I think it's still going to be pretty good. For a tighter form to it, what I would have done actually, instead of having it do its final rise in the bowl and transfer it, is I could have actually done that finger drag technique to make a really, really tight ball with it, and then baked it like that just before putting it in, and then the oven spring would help it get a lot more volume too. but this is going to be a pretty delicious loaf. So that's basically it. Oh, one other thing I should note, there are a number of different ways to tell if the bread is fully baked all the way through. There's the old chestnut of like tapping it on the bottom. If it sounds hollow, it's done. But that's really pretty subjective. Hard to really tell whether or not it sounds right. The best advice that I got on that was from, I believe it was from one of Ken Forkish's books on sourdough baking, which I refer to a lot, and that is to use a digital thermometer, a little probe thermometer, and like a meat roasting thermometer, and the temperature that you want the internal temperature of the bread to reach to know that it's done at or close to sea level is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's exactly the temperature that I pulled these out at. One other note as well, when I took the lids off of the baguette baker and the bread cloche, I turned the temperature down to 425. It had actually just hit 460 before I did that, and turned it down to 425 to finish baking. If you, after about another 20 minutes or so, it still wasn't up to temperature, which could happen with a bigger boule, then what I would have done is turned the temperature down even further, down to 375, taken the bread out of the bread cloche or whatever I was baking it in, and put it directly on the rack to finish baking out in the middle. I think that's basically it. So that's the start to finish of my sourdough bread making process. Hopefully you guys find it useful. That's it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to comment below or send me an email. All right, thanks.